Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for Get on the Bus 2024. We had hoped to see everyone in New York City for an in-person event, but that was not in the cards for this year. So we're grateful that you're able to join us here on Zoom. And now that we're able to record it, that many of our other friends who aren't with us right now will be able to watch the video of Get on the Bus afterwards. My name is Kelly Turley. I'm one of the co-coordinators of Amnesty International Local Group 133. We're based in Somerville, Massachusetts. And we're really grateful that you're here with us for our 29th annual Get on the Bus for Human Rights. We are it's a labor of love for Group 133 and our friends that help make Get on the Bus happen each year. Since 2020, Get on the Bus has been a virtual event after the onset of COVID-19. And we'll see what happens for next year if we are able to return to New York City for an in-person event. But a key part of Get on the Bus each year is our speakers panel, where we hear from activists and advocates around the world who are on the front lines and doing work on major human rights issues, often issues that may not be in the headlines. And so this year's Get on the Bus, we're focusing on human rights issues in Egypt, globally related to the United Nations, in Sri Lanka, in Tibet, in China, in Iran. And we will hear today from activists talking a bit about the human rights issues that we're focused on for Get on the Bus. We'll be using the chat to share some links with you throughout the program. And please feel free to also use the chat back to introduce yourself, who you are, where you're from. And we'll also have some time at the end for questions and answers. And so we'll at that point, just ask you to raise your virtual hand or raise your physical hand and we can unmute you. We are really grateful to be joined today from the UK by Amnesty International USA's Executive Director, Paul O'Brien. We're so grateful, Paul, that you're able to make time to join with us. And so I'm going to make you a co-host and turn it over to you to share some welcoming remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Kelly. But I'm one of the few people who was probably thrilled to hear it was virtual because I wanted to hear about this legendary gathering and to be there to hear. I just looked at the panelists. It's what an amazing group of topics. If I'm the only thing standing between you and it, I'm going to shut up because I'm dying to hear. I know these are tough stories about difficult realities, but it is a profound privilege to be able to sit and hear some of these stories and to find out what we can do. And grateful for others who kept the heartbeat of Get on the Bus alive. And yeah, I too look forward to the day where we can get on a real bus with each other again someday and do it. Thanks for having me. Oh, Dave, you really didn't have to do that. I just want folks to know that I've been a fan since 1969, and I have serious misgivings about their current financial situations. But okay, Dave, that is war. Okay. For those on whom that is completely lost, it's better that it stays that way. There are human rights issues.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, David. So as I mentioned, one of the areas that we're focused on for this year's Get on the Bus for Human Rights is human rights issues in Egypt. And in particular, we are focused on calling for the release of Aisha el-Shater and her husband. And we are grateful to be joined today by our first guest speaker, Youssef Abdel Fattah. And we have been working with our teams at Amnesty, country specialists, to learn more about what's going on in Egypt right now. And we're grateful that Youssef is also here to talk more. And I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kelly, for having me. And it's really a privilege to be here among so many wonderful speakers. Just to start off, I think what I want to do first is I'd be remiss if I was at an event on human rights like this and didn't sort of make mention of what's going on in Gaza right now. and sort of the slaughtering of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians. And also to note that sort of these global systems of oppression are connected, right? And sometimes we see these connections quite blatantly. Just yesterday, Egyptian activists were arrested in front of the journalist syndicate for protesting in support of Palestine, in support of Gaza, sort of victimized by one oppressive system while showing their support for their brothers and sisters victimized by another. And so, like you said, I'm here today to talk about a very specific Egyptian political prisoner and one who's been in prison right now for over 5.5 years. And in that time has been subjected not just to arbitrary arrest and unjust detention, but also to enforced disappearance, to torture, to solitary confinement, and to all the sort of medley of abuses that happen sort of just by virtue of the poor detention conditions that exist in these prisons. So just as a little bit of background, on November 1st, 2018, Aisha el-Shater and her husband, Mohamed Abo Horeira, were arrested from their home. And Aisha was forcibly disappeared for 3 weeks, during which time she was subjected to sort of severe torture. She was beaten, she was electrocuted. And her husband were targeted in part for their own vocal human rights advocacy and their participation in what was known as the Egyptian Coordination for Rights and Freedoms, which is a human rights group, sort of not much unlike the one that's sort of organizing this panel, right? But for their participation in this, and also because of her relationship to her father, Khairat al-Shater, who was a prominent jailed opposition leader, who I should note is also unjustly detained. And this was part of a still existing pattern of hostage taking and familial retribution that the Egyptian government consistently engages in. Her husband, Mohamed Abo Horeira, is and was a prominent human rights lawyer, and he himself, after their arrest, was disappeared for nearly 4 months, during which time he was also beaten and abused and tortured. Sort of after this period of enforced disappearance, Aisha was transferred to El-Qanater women prison and held in prolonged solitary confinement in a small, poorly ventilated cell, a cell without a toilet, and she was only allowed to leave twice a day for less than 30 minutes, only to use the bathroom and then return. The name of the couple, sorry, just seeing the comment, the name of the couple is Aisha el-Shater, and maybe somebody could type it in the chat, but Aisha el-Shater is the wife and Mohamed Abo Horeira is the husband. Yeah, and there's sort of several Amnesty urgent actions about them that has lots of information. But sort of there was even a period of time where reportedly Aisha wasn't allowed to leave the cell at all, not even to use the bathroom, denied any sanitary facilities, and actually was forced to use a bucket, right? Since her detention, the prison administration has prevented Aisha from receiving any family visits, communicating with her family in any way, and even communicating with her lawyer as well in prison. And on top of all this, Aisha suffers from aplastic anemia, which is a rare and serious condition that affects the blood and severely increases her risk of infection and uncontrolled bleeding. And this is sort of compounded by the extremely unhygienic conditions that detainees in Egyptian prisons are subjected to. And despite her medical issues, prison officials have repeatedly denied her access to adequate health care. And as a result, her health deteriorated rapidly, leading to spinal cord issues and to bone marrow failure. The family even offered to pay the cost of her treatment, but prison authorities have refused repeatedly. And she actually had to have 2 life-saving emergency transfusions because of her medical issues. And to note, all of these things happened just in the period of pretrial detention. Technically, Egyptian law allows for pretrial detention for up to 2 years in the most extreme cases, but this law is routinely violated, and it would be almost 4 years before Aisha would be referred to any trial. And unfortunately, this trial occurred before an emergency state security court, despite the fact that the Egyptian state of emergency had ended a year beforehand. The trial began September 11, 2022, again, nearly a year after the state of emergency was lifted the previous October. And they were sentenced to 10 years for Aisha, 15 years for Mohammed. I think it's also important to note here that the emergency trials involve massive due process violations. They cannot be appealed. Only the president has the power to authorize or commute a sentence. The defendants were unable to speak to their lawyers at this time. The lawyers had no access to any of the case files. The court hearings were held in a secret complex within another prison, the Bedr prison complex. Family members were not allowed to attend the trial. And so they were subsequently convicted basically without any due process. And then, like I said, Mohammed was sentenced to 15 years, Aisha to 10. And then they were both also added to the terrorist entities list, which leads to asset freezes and to travel bans, so even post-release. Last year, Aisha was transferred to a new prison, recently built 10th of Ramadan prison, where her conditions have remained very similar. She still has no access to sunlight. She's not allowed outside. She now shares a cell with 2 other people, but is banned from having any personal belongings or even from receiving any food items from her family, which is something that many detainees rely on because the conditions of prison food are so horrible to be almost inedible. And again, sort of this was all simply for her activism and for her human rights advocacy and for her relationship to her father. But sort of Aisha's a prominent name. There are sort of many other thousands of Egyptian prisoners whose names you will probably never hear about. And just in terms of Egyptian women in prisons, we know that there are at least 300 female political prisoners, so specifically on political charges, not what we would sort of consider sort of criminal detainees, quote unquote, but specifically 300 Egyptian female political prisoners. And at least 280 of them are on pretrial detention. So without any, staying in prison without sort of being convicted of anything. And women have it sort of particularly bad in Egyptian prisons. Sort of from the moment of arrest to the moment that they're transferred to the prison, it's essentially sort of like one long period of sustained violations. And I'm sorry in advance for the things that I'm about to say, because I know that they could be sort of real graphic and real traumatizing. And I know that they're hard to hear, but so these are the things that really happen, right? So the first thing that happens post-arrest is that women are sent, well, all prisoners, but women included, are sent to these unofficial detention centers, most of them linked to the National Security Agency. And this is where people are disappeared for the most part. And in these places, they're often stripped, they're sexually assaulted, they're beaten, they're tortured. We even have cases documented where a woman's children are brought in and she's sort of tortured and abused in front of them as a means of leveraging her and trying to get her to admit to things that she has nothing to do with. And again, these are sort of all happening in unofficial detention centers. And so on the record and according to the Egyptian government, these things never happen, right? So there's no record of any of these sort of formally in the case files. Following this, she's then sent to the office of the prosecutor. So now begins the period of official detention. And during which time they're again continually subjected to abuse and humiliation. We even again have documented evidence of women being stripped and harassed and threatened with sexual assault and other forms of violence inside the office of the prosecutor and in front of the prosecutor, again, in an attempt to sort of psychologically break them and force them into signing confessions. This all happens before Open even reaches the prison, where again, the cycle of abuse continues. In addition to all the abuses we've already talked about, a new kind of abuse is introduced, right? Where detainees like Aisha Shelter suffer from medical negligence, they suffer from solitary confinement, they suffer from denial of access to visitation, they're not allowed outside of their cells for extended periods of time. Many of them are denied any family visits from the moment of their arrest. This happened to Aisha, but this also happened to, for example, with Abdul Minan, this happened to Sumaya Meher, and this has happened to many other detainees. And then, of course, there are the forms of physical and psychological torture that we've already recounted. In the new prison specifically, like the 10th of Ramadan prison, which Aisha was recently transferred to, female detainees have also complained about being constantly surveilled. So all of these prison cells have these new fancy cameras that they've installed in them, meaning that for the most part, most of the women have to basically remain fully dressed at all times, in fear of the recordings being used against them. Women who wear the headscarf have to keep that on at all times. And it's sort of gotten so bad that there's even reports of detainees attempting to sleep in shifts so they can cover each other's bodies in case anything gets exposed. And this is all just things that happen in the prison, right? This isn't to mention any of the second and third order effects of imprisonment. And so the situation is sort of very obviously really, really tough. I know that this has been sort of a depressing talk, but I think for the last 30 seconds or so, I want to just say that it's not that there's no hope, right? We've seen in the past that pressure works. Pressure really works on specific cases. It works on getting prison conditions improved. And so that's why sort of we're all here, and I'm very glad to see all of you here today. Sort of pressure is really the key. So pressure sort of locally to your congressional offices, pressure internationally with the UN, all of these things really help, and it really makes a difference for the prisoners in Egypt who really, really need your assistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yusuf. And to note, we added some links in the chat, but on the Get on the Bus website, we have an actions and issues page that has more information about the countries and actions we're focused on for this year's Get on the Bus. We'll also reshare the link to the speaker's bio page so you can learn more about our speakers. Next, we're going to transition to talk about human rights issues in Sri Lanka. And this year, as we prepared for Get on the Bus, we take action proposals from Group 133 members, Amnesty International USA country specialists, as well as other allied activists. And we had 2 action proposals focused on human rights issues in Sri Lanka, and the group decided that both of them were really critical issues that we wanted to uplift. So the first Sri Lanka action that we want to talk about focuses on the Trinco Five, and I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Jim McDonald, who's the country specialist for Sri Lanka, to be able to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Kelly. As Kelly said, I'm the Sri Lanka country specialist for Amnesty International USA. I have the honor of introducing our speaker for today's action, Lakshmi Saravanapathan. I've had the privilege of working with Lakshmi over the past several years, including for prior Get on the Bus events. Lakshmi is a PhD candidate conducting research on socio-environmental, justice-driven community conflicts against the extractive industry. Growing up in Sri Lanka and witnessing the hardships faced by her Tamil community during the Civil War inspired her focus to work in sustainable development. She holds experience engaging on this topic across sectors ranging from sustainable investing in financial firms to research in government and multilateral agencies in the US and Sri Lanka. Lakshmi's active engagement with human rights campaigns began during her undergraduate years at the University of Chicago, where she served as publicity and public relations chair for student organizations such as Amnesty International U Chicago and the Partnership for Advancement of Refugee Rights. Since then, she has participated as a speaker for Amnesty International USA, addressing multiple issues such as media freedom and gender equality in Sri Lanka. Now happy to turn it over to Lakshmi.
Thank you very much, Jim. Hello, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to speak at this forum once again. So we are here today to address a case that strikes at the very core of our shared beliefs. And that's the need for uncompromising respect for human rights for all. And the Trinco Five is a glaring example of a miscarriage of justice and cruelty, not only to the affected victims who were killed, but also to the long-term suffering of their families who have not yet been given closure. Now, before I proceed, I do want to put out a slight alert that I will be describing events of extreme violence, and I understand that that can be triggering and harrowing to some. So I do want to issue a trigger warning on that. So the case we're discussing happened on January 2006. 5 young Tamil students were brutally murdered in the seaside town of Trincomalee in Sri Lanka. Their names were Manoharan Rajiharan, Yogaraja Hemachandra, Logit Raja Rohan, Thangadure Sivananda, and Shanmugaraja Gajendran. Now, other organizations have reported on what happened that evening. I will be following the events as explained by Human Rights Watch. Now, the students were reported to have been sitting in an area by the beach when a 3-wheeler approached. A 3-wheeler is what we commonly use in Sri Lanka. It's a very, very small taxi. and suddenly a grenade was thrown out of the vehicle, causing a blast. The area was then immediately blocked by Navy personnel. No civilian could go in or out. And then shortly thereafter, a jeep carrying security forces, identified then to be the police special task force, arrived through the dark of night. The injured students were then forcefully dragged into the said vehicle and subjected to brutal beatings. And despite their pleas, they were then dragged back out of the vehicle and mercilessly shot dead. Shots were fired into their heads, abdomens, and chest, a scene of absolute horror. Now, I have spoken about this event on this platform before, and what I try to explain to those who are unfamiliar with the case and the location of this incident of extreme brutality is that this didn't happen in an isolated location where there was no help around. The location was near Trincomalee town, and I have very strong familial ties with Trinco, and I've spent a significant amount of time there. So let me assure you that it is a bustling town. And crucially, during this period of time, it was heavily occupied by government security personnel, and there were multiple checkpoints around. But despite the presence of all of the security and the checkpoints in the area, on that fateful night when the boys were being tortured and killed, there was no protection officers there to save them. Even the ordinary citizens who attempted to intervene were thwarted, as in the case of Dr. Manoharan, who was one of the victims' fathers. Dr. Manoharan had gone searching for his son after receiving a very harrowing message from him. But he was stopped by security personnel on the location. And it's reported that the father heard the sound of the boys' cries and then the gunshots. Now, the anguish for the families of the victims didn't end with a particular tragic night, because 2 decades later, we're still grappling with the pursuit of justice and answers for the deaths of their loved ones. 18 years have passed, marked by multiple government regime changes, numerous calls for inquiries, and a stark absence of adequate justice. Even the Sri Lankan government's own investigations, such as the report from the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission inquiry, commanded by the then president in the aftermath of the Civil War, acknowledged that there were strong grounds to believe the involvement of uniformed personnel in the killings of the Trinco Five. Yet despite these findings, the consequences for the attackers have been woefully inadequate. Now, in terms of legal repercussions, a group of special task force officers were initially arrested in connection with the killings in 2006, but they were later released due to a lack of evidence. And then subsequent arrests were made in 2013 after mounting of international pressure, but this also resulted in the release of the suspects on bail. Now, from the beginning, all the attempts of legal justice were extremely lengthy and arduous for the witnesses and the families involved. Many of the families and witnesses reported being harassed and intimidated. The threats made were so severe that some fled the country seeking asylum and security for their lives. In 2015, during the process of the most recent legal proceedings, efforts were made by the government, headed by then President Sirisena and Prime Minister, now President Ranil Wickremesinghe, to facilitate testimony from the witnesses who had fled to other countries, but through the Sri Lankan missions abroad. However, as the testimony could only be given through the missions, many witnesses often didn't feel safe to participate in the process, and understandably also started questioning the efficacy of the proceedings. So ultimately, in July 2019, all the members under investigation were discharged by the Sri Lankan Trincomalee Magistrates Court. This effectively ended the trial without any semblance of justice, because at the end of the trial, the families and the witnesses were no closer to finding answers than they were when they first learned of the young boy's death. And such a conclusion is obviously very disappointing. But it underscores the urgency for international activists to continue advocating for justice for this cause, even though it has been quite a long, drawn one. Because it is this pressure that will ensure that the deaths of the students are not forgotten, and inquiries continue to be made until fair judgment is received. Now, I can speak to the importance of this from personal experience. My father runs a newspaper company called Udayan in Jaffna in Sri Lanka. And growing up in the shadow of this company, I witnessed firsthand the extremely dire consequences faced by journalists and the staff who dared to speak up for Tamil equality and human rights. And these brave individuals were met with violence time and time again. Some were violently beaten, others were shot dead, and some even went missing. And the perpetrators were often identified to be paramilitary or government supporting groups. And I witnessed the repeated impunity granted to them for their attacks. In 2009, my maternal uncle, Vidyadhar Naresa Pillai, who was newspaper editor, was abducted by members who came in a white van. This happened while he was attending a family funeral. There was no issued warrant. We didn't know his whereabouts. He was simply violently taken. And it was because of the quick and extremely intense international intervention that we were able to find out that he was being held by the police under suspicions of LTT affiliations, which were false allegations. He was ultimately released with no convictions against him. And why I'm telling you this story is because in the personal case that I went through, it was absolutely because of the international intervention of diaspora, activists like you, international organizations, that we were able to get my uncle back. Now, in the case of the Trinco Five, we unfortunately can't get the precious lives of the young boys back. But their loved ones deserve closure. So even though it has been almost 2 decades, they deserve answers for the atrocities done to those boys. And that is why I urge and encourage everyone here to keep up your very important action, remembering and fighting for their rights. The actions, the words of organizations like On the Bus and all of you here today matter, because it is your actions which will one day ensure justice for the Trinco Five. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi, and to Jim for the introduction. Now we're going to continue discussing human rights in Sri Lanka and the need for international justice for mass graves in Sri Lanka. And I want to introduce our longtime colleague, a member of Amnesty Group 133, Rick Roth, who's going to introduce our next speaker.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce my friend, Sri Lankan journalist Tissa. He was a longtime journalist, and then he was arrested in 2008. He was tried in 2009 on trumped-up charges and given a 20-year sentence. And through the intervention of his family, friends, and included Group 133 of Amnesty, he was pardoned for not doing anything and released, and he came to the United States, but none of that stopped him, and he's continued to be a very active journalist and a human rights activist. I don't think it's common that someone on whose behalf you work on their case, they then join you in working on others' cases, but that's the kind of guy he is. So with great pleasure, I introduce my friend Tissa.
Thank you, Rick, for that introduction. And as always, thank you, Amnesty, Branch 133, AIUSA, and Amnesty International for supporting me and my wife. Though not in prison, my wife had to endure dark times, hounded by the Sri Lanka government, as I did within the confines of a jail. A prisoner's experience behind bars does not follow a steady trajectory. It is in the early hours and days when you are completely alien to the new ecosystem of brutality and violence that the worst things happen to you. But sometimes the involvement of an individual or institution from outside that ecosystem, essentially an international call for justice, provides a jolt to the balance of that system. The imbalance, however small, can create larger ripples. That was what Amnesty's intervention in my case provided me, my wife, and our families. Today, 16 years from the day I was arrested and 15 since the day of the civil war, Sri Lanka's violent state repression continues. One moment, I'm trying to show a slide, excuse me. Okay. Sorry about that. Today, 16 years from the day I was arrested and 15 since the end of the civil war, Sri Lanka's violent state repression continues. And the international community needs to overcome its reticence and speak out against both past mass atrocities and ongoing grave human rights violations, especially to provide international justice mechanism to investigate Sri Lanka's mass graves and to bring the perpetrators to justice. And this is a subject that I will be speaking on for the next few minutes. At least 20 mass graves have been uncovered in Sri Lanka to date. Most of them are probably from atrocities committed during the country's civil war that occurred when Tamils, resisting repression and discrimination by the Sinhala Buddhist-controlled state, rose up. In 2009, the civil war ended when the military defeated the armed group Liberation Tigers of Tamil, popularly known as the LTTE. More than 100,000 died and over 20,000 disappeared. The most recent mass grave was discovered in Kokutodawai on June 29th last year by workers laying water pipes. Kokutodawai is in the Mullaitivu district, the eye of the fighting between Tamil rebels and the Sri Lankan military. However, the Tamil villages near Kokutodawai were forcibly depopulated by the army in 1984 and controlled by government forces until the end of the civil war. What followed the uncovering of the graves shows how Sri Lanka violates the rule of law, the feeble political will of its leaders, and the plight of the victims. On July 6th, when exhumations began, standard operating procedures were flouted. Heavy machinery was used in the first instance to dig the area where the bodies were found. There was no soil testing. There was no perimeter setup. The graves remained open to the elements and to intruders who could have contaminated the evidence on site. The evidence was collected and was improperly placed in cardboard boxes, as you can see on the slide. A perimeter was set up only after lawyers and others protested. When exhumations were arbitrarily halted by the government in December, 40 bodies had been recovered and over 100 artifacts, including uniforms and dog tags of rebel LTTE personnel and female undergarments. Exhumation has not resulted because the government claims that it has no money. The Tamil public was concerned for the integrity of the exhumation. On July 28th, they forced a shutdown of the northern east of Sri Lanka, demanding international monitoring of the process. They also demanded that the remains be identified and returned to the next of kin. The reason was that the reason was not only the shoddy process and the Kokutoduvai site, it was also history. 4 years earlier, in May 2018, a mass grave was unearthed in the Tamil majority Mannar district. Discovered by workers excavating near the cooperative building where an army camp had stood during the Civil War, the site rendered 318 bodies, including 28 children. Then too, the government contravened standard proceedings of a forensic investigation. The gravesite was not protected or sanitized from outside elements. Bodies were found shackled, and there were biscuit wrappers nearby. Yet, when the remains were sent for testing to the US, the carbon dating put the bones between 1499 and 1750. 18th century bodies were with 20th century shackles and biscuit wrappers. Very strange indeed. Following an outcry against the mishandling of evidence, the courts charged the government forensic archaeologists to analyze the evidence and report back by June 2019. We heard nothing. Last July, 4 years after the government demanded the initial report, the Mannar Court judge again ordered a comprehensive report. There was also a willful attempt to ensure that the evidence was not protected. For 2 years, it remained stored in a courthouse storeroom without climate control or security. In 2020, the room was broken into and evidence tampered with. The slide shows the neglect of the Mannar mass grave. The photo on the right shows the condition now of the grave, with garbage and water filling the site. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because justice is important, not simply for the dead, but for the living. Radha is a woman from Pudukkudiyiruppu in the Mullaitivu district. Her son disappeared during the final weeks of the Civil War. Despite writing and giving evidence before many presidential commissions of inquiry, the government has not provided her answers about the disappearance. Radha now exists between hope and despair. Hope her son is alive and will return, or that he is dead and thereby beyond suffering. But when there is news that a mass grave has been discovered, she is on edge, that her son's body might be in it. The news of Kokutoduvai doubled her agony because it is relatively near to where she now lives and where she saw her son last. She feared that there might be a piece of clothing to prove his identity, which the government might try to cover up. But the clothing recovered was of LTT personnel and female underwear, neither which would have been worn by him. Now she returns to a life in limbo, awaiting with trepidation the news about the next mass grave. Radha and the other families of the disappeared, traumatized each time a grave is opened, only to find the bodies are not identified, do not trust the Sri Lanka government anymore. They are also keenly aware that after disappearing their relatives, military and police personnel walk free on the streets, enjoying impunity because no Sri Lankan government will make them accountable for their crimes. It is because they are aware of the impunity military and police personnel enjoy, and that by protecting criminals, the Sri Lankan state is potentially facilitating future mass atrocities, that Radha and others are calling for international justice. And part of that is for the international monitoring for the preservation and investigation of mass graves. As I said in the beginning, persistent calls for justice from outside Sri Lanka was what jolted the government to eventually release me. The families of the disappeared are a strong and resilient movement calling for justice. But forceful voices from outside will help their cause. Therefore, we, you and I, must join our voices with the families of the disappeared and call for international justice for mass graves and other atrocity crimes in Sri Lanka. Please click on this link and take action, or go to the Get on the Bus website and sign the petition. Your voice will make the difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tissa, for your testimony, your partnership, and your leadership on these issues. We're grateful, as Rick said, to call you a friend and colleague, and we're grateful that you're still part of Group 133. And thank you to Renette for the technical assistance. I'm guessing it was her in the background. Next, I would like to turn it over to Elise Auerbach. Elise is the AIUSA Iran country specialist who will introduce our Iran Action and our Iran Action speaker.
Thank you, everybody. I'm afraid I'm a little bit disembodied because my camera doesn't work on this particular device. But yes, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Shaheen Milani, who's the director of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. So Shaheen obtained his JD from Howard University School of Law and his LLM from Vermont Law School. Shaheen is the principal author of several Iran Human Rights Documentation Center reports, including Denied Identity, Human Rights Abuses Against Iran's LGBT Community, Apostasy in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Controlled and Pursued Labor Activism in Contemporary Iran, Extreme Inequality, and many other very important reports. I should say that what the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center does is very in-depth research on longstanding human rights violations and reports, whereas Amnesty obviously, puts out actions on, sort of on an urgent basis of things that are going on right now in real time. Both are extremely important, and both definitely have to happen as we work hand in hand to promote human rights in Iran. And also, the very important process of documenting human rights violations, which is so important for the survivors of human rights and for the international community. So the focus of the Get on the Bus action on Iran is actually two cases of people who have been persecuted because of their decision to peacefully engage in a peaceful protest against the Iranian government. So Vahid Afkari actually was arrested in 2018 with his two brothers just for engaging in peaceful protests. The brothers were accused of engaging in criminal behavior, including the death of an Iranian government agent. There's absolutely zero evidence that they ever took part in such criminal behavior. But one of Vahid's brothers was executed in 2000, and Vahid himself has been sentenced to a ridiculously long prison sentence. The other case that we're working on, Toomaj Salehi, is actually someone who is a very, very prominent and very famous and well-loved rapper and hip-hop artist. And he was arrested in 2022 because of his support of the protests that broke out in Iran in the fall of 2022. And he's been sentenced to a long prison term. He's been subjected to very harsh treatment, torture, and beatings in custody. And we're working very hard to get both of them out. And we want the international community and everyone to work very hard to release them. I encourage everybody to take our Nowruz action. Nowruz is the Persian New Year. And our Nowruz action is up on the Amnesty International website on the Iran page. I can put it in the chat also, so you can access it. And I would like to turn it over to Shaheen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elise, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Kelly, as well. And I also want to thank the previous speakers for their wonderful insights into human rights abuses in Egypt and Sri Lanka. This is all of these are interrelated. We're just one human family, and we suffer injustice in different forms, in different countries by different regimes, but ultimately it's just denial of our basic human rights that we're talking about. So today I'm gonna speak broadly about what is going on in Iran now and what's been happening since 2022. As many of you may remember, there were massive protests across Iran that erupted in September 2022 after the killing of a young woman named Mahsa Jina Amini. She lost her life while in police custody. She was arrested for improper veiling, basically. And then she was hospitalized and then she died. And this resulted in massive protests across the country because this is a long-running issue that the government tends to arrest women, detain them, just arbitrarily based on the-spot decisions that their covering of their hair and their body is not adequate. And under Iranian law, that's punishable by a fine or imprisonment. So her deaths caused massive protests across the country, and then the government again cracked down on those protests, and that crackdown resulted in about 500 deaths. So 500 people were killed in a matter of months across Iran because they protested the death of this one woman. And the government forces took aim at protesters, directly firing at people, which resulted in these many deaths. Of course, it's a major human rights violation. The UN in November 2022 established a fact-finding mission, and the fact-finding mission just released its initial report, and the mandate of the fact-finding mission has been extended for another year. So hopefully we'll get more reporting on the atrocities that happened in Iran. Today, I'm just going to discuss and focus on a few aspects of these events that took place in Iran. Some of the aspects that may not be as broadly discussed. First, I want to mention that the fact that the deadliest day of the protests were September. It was on September 30th, 2022, on which about 100 people were shot and killed in Zahedan. That's a city in southeastern Iran, in Sistan and Balochistan province. So basically, 1/5 of all the people who were killed during these protests were just killed on one day in Zahedan. What is important to note is that the people in Zahedan are mostly of Baluch ethnicity, and they tend to be Sunni Muslims. We have a government which is Shia, and its governance structure is based on Shia jurisprudence. That's how they claim their legitimacy. And we have victims who are Sunni and who they consider a very disproportionate share of the victims. So on one day in Zahedan, again, 100 people were killed. And these were people who had gathered to pray at the city's Musalla, the city's grand prayer hall. And we had security forces who were firing into the prayer center. And all these people were killed. Now, often in the media, we hear about the women who were killed in Iran, especially young women. And their stories, of course, they deserve attention, as anybody's would. But I want to, again, highlight that the ethnic minorities, particularly Sunni ethnic minorities, they bear a very disproportionate burden, and their share of the victims is much higher than the share of the population. So we had about 100 people who were killed in one day in Zahedan, in Sistan and Baluchistan province. On the other side of the country, in the west and northwest, we have areas that are populated by Kurdish Iranians. And especially in and Kurds in Iran, they're both Sunni Kurds and they're Shia Kurds. A lot of protests happened in areas that Sunni Kurds reside, in Kurdistan province, also in West Azerbaijan province. And again, about 100 people were killed in those areas. So adding those up, 100 in Sistan Baluchistan province, 100 in Kurdistan province and Kurdish regions. So we have almost like 40% of the victims were Sunni or came from areas that are mostly populated by Sunni Iranians, and that's a very disproportionate share. We don't know exactly how many Sunnis are Iran, or what's their share of the population, but it's not 40%. So those are some of the facts that it has to be kept in mind. Remember, Iran is a Shia theocracy, and the government imposes religious law, and it derives its legitimacy from the claim that it has on Shia jurisprudence, right? So that's how they govern, and of course you have a situation in which non-Muslims, and particularly individuals who are not Shia, they tend to suffer the most. Another aspect of the protest that I want to discuss is the issue of blindings. There have been numerous cases of individuals who have lost their eyesight because government forces shot at protesters' eyes and their heads, and so many were killed, but many also have lost their eyesight, and that is probably a crime against humanity on its own, to target people in a way that ensures that a great many will lose their eyesight. And we've had individuals like this young woman named Kosar Eftekhari, who was shot in Tehran and has lost one eye. That when she talked about her situation, she talked about her case, the government again went after her and arrested her and actually started another case against her to put her in prison. So eventually she had no option but to leave Iran. And now she resides in Europe. So we've had that situation that individuals who've been wrong, even when they try to go to the authorities and seek justice within Iran, they face prosecution. The government, instead of helping them, the government goes after them through the judicial process, and persecutes them. We've also had the parents of individuals who were killed in protests, when they started to talk about their loved ones, their children who've been lost, they've been arrested themselves. Like Mashallah Karami is one person. His son was killed. His son was executed, and then he is now in prison. Or we have Mohamed Abo, whose son was killed in November 2019 during nationwide protests that happened that year. But now, again, he's in prison right now because he spoke out about the case of his son. We've had about 10 executions of protesters. The Iranian government has arrested these people and charged them with very serious crimes. One crime is called Moharebe, which means waging war against God. So the Iranian government sees itself as being an agent of God, and a person who protests against it can face the charge of waging war against God. So we've had individuals who were charged with that crime and have been executed. And these individuals, they often are tortured severely, and they're forced to provide confessions that then those confessions will be used against them in a court of law. One of the men who was killed was a young man named Majid Reza Rahnavar. I invite you to search his name and look for the video of him on YouTube. As he's being taken to the gallows, the Iranian TV actually goes and interviews him and asks, what are his thoughts, but he shows no remorse, shows no regret, and says that I don't want anybody to be sad about it. So he's showing immense courage in the face of the most brutal situation, that is his impending execution. We've had these profiles in courage, these individuals who've been executed under the most severe situation, under the most severe torture. And several other individuals are also facing charges that could lead to the death penalty. Of course, the subjugation of women continues in Iran. Women are constantly being harassed, being arrested, being fined while driving their cars. They get fines for not covering their hair. So that this is an ongoing issue, and the government doesn't seem to relent on that. So this issue is continuing. The Iran government also engages in a wide variety of human rights abuses. Floggings, is a form of torture, happens in Iran. The Iran government amputates fingers of individuals accused of theft, which is a very gross violation of human rights, a gross violation of human dignity. And it's a violation of the ban on cruel and inhumane and degrading punishment. That's something that the Iranian government regularly does. Religious minorities are always being persecuted and imprisoned. Baha'is, for example, are regularly arrested, imprisoned. Their cemeteries are often destroyed, and their youth are deprived of the right to higher education. So, Iran is just, as I said before, there's a plethora of issues of human rights violations that happening in the country. Another one is the imprisonment of people for failure to pay a financial debt or obligation. That's a clear violation of Article 11 of the ICCPR. We have thousands of people who are imprisoned just because they have a debt, they have a financial debt, and they cannot pay that debt, so they're in prison. And those individuals in prison, they're not sentenced to prison. It's just indefinite detention until they can somehow satisfy their debt or that their creditors forgive their debts. So Iran is actually it presents a very grave human rights situation in all forms. Minorities, women, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, just LGBT individuals. Again, same-sex relations are a crime under Iranian law. It could be punishable by death. Even things like drinking alcohol. The Iran government executed a person a couple of years ago for drinking alcohol, and they never even released his name. We don't know the name of the person who was executed, but they just announced that they had executed the person after a sixth conviction for drinking alcoholic beverages. So that's the kind of a government that we're dealing with. And the Iranian people are really fed up with this regime, and they've taken to the streets over and over again in the hopes of having a democratic government in place that represents them and changes its policy both domestically and internationally. The Iranian people are just fed up with this international isolation, and they want a new life for themselves. But they have to fight this regime, and they like the other speakers previously mentioned, international support is really important for them. So efforts by Amnesty International and the local chapters are really important, and you all help that the voices of the Iranian people and those around the world are heard and are not ignored internationally, because a lot is going on across the world, and people everywhere deserve democracy and respect for their rights, and people in Iran are no exception. So that's the conclusion of my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shaheen. And I know that there were some questions in the chat, and so if you have a chance to look at those, but we'll also have some time after our speakers for people to come off of mute and ask questions. But thank you so much, Shaheen, and to Elise for talking about this year's Iran action. As we talked about with Sri Lanka, when we were reviewing action proposals from Group 133 members and allies, we had 2 action proposals focused on human rights issues related to the Chinese government, including the imprisonment of Tibetans and other political prisoners and mass detentions in Xinjiang. And so I want to turn it over to our first China Action speaker, who is going to talk about human rights issues in Tibet. And we are pleased to be joined today by Tenzin Yonten, who is part of Students for a Free Tibet, and we're sorry we weren't able to have you join us in person in New York. We know that that you're located in the New York, New Jersey area as part also of Students for a Free Tibet, New York, New Jersey, and from LaSalle Academy. But I want to turn it over to Tenzin Yonten to share some remarks.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Tenzin Yonten, and thank you so much to Amnesty for offering this platform. It is an honor to be speaking with all of you today. I'm a youth activist with Students for a Free Tibet. We're a network of young people who work in solidarity with Tibetans and their struggle for independence. Since the 1950s, Tibet has been wrongfully occupied by the Chinese Communist Party, and ever since, there has been a lack of basic human rights in Tibet. Today, 1 million Tibetan children, as young as 4 years old, are forced to enroll in state-run Chinese boarding schools. In these colonial boarding schools, children are ripped away from their families and stripped of their right to speak their own language and practice their culture. This is China's attempt at committing genocide against the Tibetan people. Had my grandfathers and grandmothers not made the nearly impossible escape from Tibet, I would be one of the kids in the colonial boarding school. I couldn't imagine being forced to be a proper Chinese citizen, stripped of my Tibetan identity. China often justifies their illegal occupation of Tibet by claiming that they are liberating and modernizing Tibet. But this liberation and modernization has resulted in the death of over 1.2 million Tibetans. They exploit Tibet's gold, silver, and other precious minerals for their own benefit. Their mining has devastated Tibet's fragile and sacred landscape and polluted its rivers. Nearly 2 billion people living in Asia rely on these rivers, making it one of the most important sources of fresh water in the world. And it is even known as the third pole. Tibet is one of the frontiers of the global climate crisis. It is warming at a rate 3 times faster than the global average. Tibet's climate crisis is the world's biggest environmental catastrophe that you have never heard of. And this is because China's censorship makes it nearly impossible to pass along information outside of Tibet. With this lack of access comes a lack of information and exposure, not only regarding the genocide in Tibet, but also about the devastating environmental crisis. Like many Tibetans, A-Nya Sengdra saw the atrocities being committed against Tibet's environment and spoke up against China. Though he organized peaceful protests and followed all the proper procedures, he was detained and beaten anyway for the crimes of gathering people to disturb public order and picking quarrels and provoking trouble. Phony charges China often brings against Tibetans that stand up to China. He was then sentenced to 7 years in prison for the crime of fighting for the Tibetan environment. In Kamdege, eastern Tibet, China is planning on the construction of a dam which will destroy at least 8 monasteries and several villages. Over 1,000 Tibetans were arrested by Chinese police for protesting the construction of this dam that would displace over 10,000 Tibetans from their homes and further ravage Tibet's environment. The Tibetans who were detained have reported brutal conditions in prison. Arrested Tibetans were given animal feed as meals, denied water for days at a time, and pressured to incriminate each other during interrogations. Locals who tried to bring food to the prisons were turned away. Even today, we have little information about the condition of detained Tibetans. We have even less knowledge on A-Nya Sengdra's whereabouts and health. It is unclear whether he's even alive. This incredible lack of information about A-Nya Sengdra is why we must continue to pressure our governments, the United Nations, and other entities that hold power to speak out for A-Nya Sengdra and all political prisoners around the world, suppressed by authoritarian and genocidal regimes. Free Tibet! Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tenzin. We've included some links in the chat around some resources about A-Nya Sengdra and his situation, but as Tenzin Yonten noted, that there's not a lot of information up to date that is available. Mentioned that we had voted on 2 actions related to China, and so although we don't have a speaker on our second China focus action, we'll include some information in the chat around the detentions in Xinjiang. We're calling on the Chinese government to end the mass detentions of Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslims that have been detained in China. And we've been focused specifically on Ekpar Asat, who is a Uyghur business person who is a founder of a social media app, and he has been imprisoned by the Chinese government and detained. There are an estimated 1 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslims in China who have been detained. And so we'll share some more links and information. And we'll also share a link so you can sign up for action alerts from Amnesty International USA's China country email list to learn about more information there. But next, I'd like to turn it over to our colleague Kip, who is the Group 133 treasurer and is organizing an action for this year's Get on the Bus related to the environment and the United Nations.
Thanks, Kelly. Hello, and thank you all for being here today. Amnesty International has declared that, quote, the climate crisis is one of the most critical threats to human rights faced by humanity. Last year was the hottest on record, and the extreme heat we now see across the planet is affecting the rights of millions of people who are losing their homes, access to food and clean water, or are dealing with the health impacts of extreme temperatures. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has concluded that the world has never seen a threat to human rights of this scope. As climate change impacts become ever more real, the calls for a complete phase-out of fossil fuels are more urgent than ever. The UN Secretary General has said those engaged in fossil fuel expansion are dangerous radicals and have business models inconsistent with human survival. Last year, UN human rights investigators directly informed a dozen businesses financing fossil fuel expansion that they are acting, quote, contrary to their own human rights responsibilities. However, many of those same businesses also enjoy the UN's endorsement as acting consistently with human rights standards and climate goals through memberships in UN-sponsored initiatives. Half of the dozen banks just mentioned are members of the UN Global Compact, which indicates members have a minimum responsibility to avoid contributing to adverse human rights impacts and are meant to employ a precautionary approach to environmental challenges. An even larger portion are in the UN Net Zero Banking Alliance, which claims members are aligned with Paris-based warming targets. Yet the UN Banking Alliance includes banks that are doing the most to fund and underwrite fossil fuel expansion. With oil majors and their allies using UN initiatives to falsely signal consistency with human rights obligations, we are calling on the UN to reform the Global Compact, the Banking Alliance, Race to Zero, and other mechanisms through which companies that are doing the most to threaten human rights are able to use the UN to falsely claim otherwise. Speaking to these issues today in a pre-recorded message is Dr. Sarah Seck, a professor at Dalhousie University in Canada. Her research and teaching focus on the relationship between international human rights law, environment, and business law. A founding member of the editorial board of the Business and Human Rights Journal, Dr. Seck has published extensively on business responsibilities in the extractive industries context, and has more recently been exploring how lessons from this research can inform approaches to environmental and climate justice. I'll now turn it over to her pre-recorded message.
Just friends, bear with me for a moment. The video did not play on the first round. We'll try it again.
Hello, my name is Sarah Seck, and I'm a professor at the Marine and Environmental Law Institute. Hello, my name is Sarah Seck, and I'm a professor at the Marine and Environmental Law Institute at Dalhousie University in Canada. I'm looking forward to sharing with you today some reflections on responsible business climate action, and in particular, the business and human rights movement at the United Nations. I'm often asked to guest lecture in climate law classes about business and human rights and climate action. And when I do that, I usually pose the following questions for students. So do you think intuitively that states and/or businesses have legally binding human rights obligations with regard to climate change? These can be phrased as duties or responsibilities. And when it comes to climate change, this can be to mitigate climate change, so to reduce emissions, to adapt to climate change, to finance climate action, and or to take responsibility for climate loss and damage. And I also asked them to reflect on to what extent we're seeing a legal case being made for those obligations. Now, the answer to that question looks different depending on whether your frame of reference is international climate law as compared to international human rights law. But increasingly, we're seeing the two come together. So if we think from an international climate law perspective, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change dates from 1992 and doesn't say anything about human rights. But in the 2015 Paris Agreement, we do see just in the preamble, the reference that I put on the slide here to human rights. So to an expectation that state parties, when they're taking action to address climate change, do have to respect, promote, and consider their obligations on human rights and other related aspects of human rights. But of course, this leaves open the question of what if parties don't take action and what kind of action? If we look at international human rights law, as I noted, the answer is a little bit different. There are, of course, many international human rights treaties. There are treaties in relation to civil and political rights, to social, economic, and cultural rights, treaties on the rights of racialized peoples, people with disabilities, women, children, and many other sources of international human rights treaty law. There's also customary international law and a range of human rights institutions that are tasked with ensuring that states do what they have agreed to do and are expected to do under human rights law. If we think back to the Paris Agreement, as I noted in 2015, and its brief reference just in the preamble to human rights, that didn't come about by accident. There was a lot of advocacy around the world that went on into promoting the idea that the new agreement being negotiated in the climate context must take into account the human rights dimensions. And one such set of messages came from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, one of the key human rights messengers. I put on the text here again a few of the key points from that message. This includes that states as duty bearers have an affirmative obligation to take effective measures to prevent and redress climate impacts, and that climate change impacts are felt on an array of internationally guaranteed human rights. But for our purposes today, what's also key is that the OHCHR key messages point out that their states have obligations to protect human rights from business harms, but also the businesses are duty bearers in and of themselves. They must be accountable for their climate impacts, and they must participate responsibly in climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts with full respect for human rights. So how did we get to that point? There have been a lot of initiatives over the years trying to make the business and human rights link, but the most notable are the 2011 United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were the outcome of various multi-stakeholder processes, which involved businesses as well as human rights organizations like Amnesty International. The guiding principles are generally understood as having three pillars. The first reinforces this idea that the core of international human rights law focuses on the state duty to protect human rights, and that includes human rights that would be affected by abuse by third parties like businesses. But the second pillar speaks directly to the idea that businesses also have a responsibility, an independent responsibility to respect human rights. And this is phrased sometimes as a societal expectation that businesses will respect human rights, and an expectation that businesses will adopt human rights policies. They'll engage in human rights due diligence processes to identify the human rights that might be impacted by their activities. And they will also ensure that any human rights affected will be remediated, as well, of course, of preventing future human rights harms. The 2011 UN Guiding Principles, though, were not the first UN initiative to address business responsibilities in relation to human rights. In 2000, the United Nations Global Compact was created. The Global Compact creates an opportunity for businesses to align their operations with 10 principles adopted by the United Nations. These include in the area of labor rights and anti-corruption, as well as human rights and the environment. And I put the human rights and environment principles on this slide for you to reflect on. The decision to become a member of the UN Global Compact initially didn't really involve much, and it has evolved over time to require a little bit more in terms of those who become members are required to report back to the United Nations every year about what they've been doing to better align their operations with these principles and also with the Sustainable Development Goals. And while initially pretty much any company could become a member of the Global Compact, this has changed over time. So now, if a company is subject to UN sanctions, or if it comes from certain industry sectors, such as one that derives revenue from the production, sale of anti-personnel landmines or cluster bombs, or if they derive revenue from the production or manufacture of tobacco, these industries are not allowed to join the UN Global Compact. They're seen as businesses that cannot align their operations with Global Compact expectations because something about their use is just simply contrary to what the United Nations stands for. If we think about climate change, the work of the Corporate Accountability Institute has made an excellent contribution in pointing to and underlining the extent to which certain large-scale fossil fuel companies and cement companies have played a disproportionate role in causing and contributing to the climate crisis over the years. And they focus in not just on carbon majors, but they and others point to the role of investors in funding and supporting the role of carbon majors in the climate crisis. Now, you can see from this image that certain companies have played a greater role than others, and this information changes over time. So again, from the Climate Accountability Institute, you see the way in which state-owned enterprises like Saudi Aramco have really taken over in terms of being the highest emitters over time. But of course, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Shell, BP are still very high on the list. And I want to sort of close by reflecting on how we should be thinking about human rights and the environment and the responsibilities of carbon majors in light of another evolution in international human rights law. In 2022, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution recognizing the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is one that surely includes a safe climate as part of the substantive aspects of a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This resolution was adopted with no states voting against, and so is of some significance, although it is not a treaty as such, but it reflects what many states already believe because it is part of state constitutions, although not so much in Canada and the United States. And it also reflects fundamentally what people believe. And so if we think back to the UN Global Compact, we might ask, are these principles that are listed here on environment and human rights, do they come up to the expectations now that would arise since 2022, given the UN General Assembly's adoption of a human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment? And as my final slide, do you think that businesses that are not implementing a credible commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and respect human rights affected by climate change should be allowed to join the United Nations Global Compact? We know that in 2017, the exclusionary list, which now includes tobacco companies, for example, was revised. Is it time to amend that exclusionary list again and include carbon majors of a certain kind? How might we evaluate what a credible commitment to reducing emissions might look like? And is that enough? I'll leave you with those questions to think about, and I hope I am able to join you at the end of your discussions on Friday. But if not, best of luck, and I wish you a wonderful session.
Thank you so much to Sarah. I don't see her here just yet. And thank you to Kip for coordinating the action and putting together the petition. We have some time built into our schedule today for questions and answers. I know that those of you who aren't presenters can't come off of mute. So if you want to put questions in the chat, raise your physical hand, raise your virtual hand for any of the speakers. We have time for questions or comments.
Hi, this is Ronette. I have a question. Sorry, I'm not on camera. My question is to Shaheen. Thank you, everyone, for your great presentations. And my question is to Shaheen Milani on Iran. What has been, actually two questions. So first, have you focused on the US government? Have you advocated to the US government to take action on these issues? And the second question is, what has been their response, if any?
Thank you very much. Well, yes, the U.S. government, as part of the Human Rights Council, U.S. is backing the Human Rights Council, so that's what we the avenue for our UN advocacy. That's what we've advocated for. To renew the mandate, so we welcome the U.S.'s involvement through the UN. Also, with respect to providing internet access to people in Iran, the U.S. has been, providing anti-filtration software for several years. That's also an important role that the U.S. has played, and we hope that it continues to play. And also there's the issue of putting Iranian officials on list of sanctions for human rights violations. So that's also another topic that's another tool that the U.S. has used, and Iranians welcome that. So those are the broad topics that we've asked the U.S. government to help. Yes.
Thank you, Shaheen. And I think that Elise wanted to add a comment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Renata and Shaheen. I just wanted to point out, a lot of our partner organizations have different campaigning methods and procedures than Amnesty does, and of course we totally respect all the work that our fantastic partner organizations do. Amnesty International USA itself does not lobby the U.S. government on Iran in any way. So we actually target our actions to the Iranian government itself. And I think we've been really effective in that way. And again, there's just a real variety in methods that different organizations take, but it's a decision that Amnesty International made, that our section does not target the U.S. government on Iran. So thank you.
Thanks for that clarification, Elise. Jack, do you want to come off of mute to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask Tenzin if he had any recommendations for us in approaching U.S. government figures, people in the government who might be relevant to policy on Tibet. Maybe he's not with us anymore.
Yeah, actually, I think maybe Tenzin had to leave. But we can follow up definitely on that question.
Yeah, I'd be interested. Thanks.
Thanks, Jack. Another key part of Get on the Bus when we do have it in person has been not only the speakers panel, but rallies in front of UN missions and other targets. But we also tried to layer in meetings with government officials. So we're not just protesting, but also having those direct conversations. And even though most of us aren't in New York City today, our colleague Jim is, and I wanted to turn it back over to Jim McDonald to talk about an upcoming meeting this afternoon with Sri Lankan officials.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm actually in the Amnesty New York office. They've made this available to me. And I appreciate their help with this. And I was off camera a little bit earlier because there was a 4.8 earthquake here that was shaking the camera slightly. So, but hopefully everything's fine and hopefully no aftershocks. But as Kelly mentioned, one of the things that we've done over the years as part of Get on the Bus is to have meetings with officials at the Sri Lankan mission to the UN when we were having Sri Lanka as part of Get on the Bus. And as we were getting ready for what we hoped was the resumption of in-person activity, I had I reached out to the Sri Lankan mission and asked I said, I'll be planning to come to New York, and would it be possible to meet with anyone from the Sri Lankan mission? And I was told the ambassador, Mohamed Paris, would be available to meet with me, and Carolyn Nash, the advocacy director for Asia, who's also here for AIUSA. So when unfortunately Get on the Bus had to switch to being virtual only, Carol and I discussed, well, should we proceed with the meeting, and decided it was useful to still proceed with it. So I am here in New York. I live in Chicago, so I flew in for this. So the one in-person event in 2024 will be this Sri Lankan mission meeting. And I hope our advocacy on the Trinco Five and on mass graves with the ambassador, whoever the ambassador has meet with us, will be hopefully impactful. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you so much.
Please, everyone, take action for the Trinco Five and on mass graves.
Thank you, Jim. We look forward to the report back on your meeting. I want to turn it back over to Renette with another question.
Yes, thanks so much, Kelly. This question is to Yusuf from Egypt. Again, thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering, in terms of the political prisoners, are there other than the couple that you spoke of, so are there big movements there, at least in the country, or is it too dangerous to have that against the political prisoners? That's the first question. The second, again, what kind of are you getting any kind of response, quote, support from the US government to have release of these political prisoners?
Yeah, thank you. I think first, in terms of is there support in country or movements in country? I think they exist to an extent, but the regime is pretty repressive. So, and the political prisoner, like the case of political prisoners, is an easy way to get repressed, or they act quite violently against that. So there are organizations in country that work to provide legal support. There are individual activists who drive it. They also get sort of shut down. So there's a sort of a small group of people who do important work in Egypt on political prisoners, but they are sort of at constant risk. Is I think the sort of headline there. In terms of response from the U.S. government, I think unfortunately one of the things the U.S. government often pays lip service to the idea of human rights in Egypt, but it often sort of gets subsumed by what they would call strategic priorities, right? I have somebody I work with likes to joke that the Biden administration says that they put human rights at the center of their foreign policy, but their foreign policy is a donut, so the center is just an empty hole. So the U.S. government has paid lip service and has it'll be in their country reports, diplomatic country reports, things like that. But in terms of real pressure, it seems to quite often get shoved to the side. I mean, we just saw sort of like massive aid packages coming from the EU and from the IMF to Egypt, and it seems like none of them had any sort of significant human rights conditionality, even though part of the assessment was that they would improve the human rights situation. The same thing sort of in U.S. foreign funding. U.S. provides $1.3 billion every year, and it's supposed to be contingent on human rights improvement, but every year the administration uses a national security waiver to push most of that money in anyway, right? Despite the lack of human rights improvement. So there's a lot of lip service, but in practice it doesn't amount too much.
Thank you, Yusuf. I see that Tenzin is back, Tenzin Yonten. So Jack, did you want to ask your question again?
Yes, thank you. Tenzin, I was wondering if there would be anything we could do in approaches to the United States government, relevant officials relevant to policy on Tibet, if there's anything you would recommend for us to do.
Something that would be very helpful is lobbying for Tibet and attending Tibet Lobby Day. And this takes place in Washington, D.C. And also like signing petitions. It may seem like something small, but it goes a long way.
Thank you, Yonten and Jack. Next, I'd like to turn it over to our colleague, David. David wanted to provide some updates on an action that we focused on at our 2023 Get on the Bus for Human Rights.
Oh, hi. Yes. Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, look, I don't have much information on all of the cases, but the one I thought people might be interested in hearing about is Leonard Peltier. But I don't really have much to report there because he's still in prison. However, he did post there's a letter he wrote to all of his supporters last month, which I am now putting in the chat. Hopefully you can access that. If many of you probably, well, I expect most of you do know about Leonard's case. It all had to do with incidents on the Pine Ridge Reservation back in the mid-70s. 2 FBI agents were shot and killed. And Leonard was arrested actually in Canada, not in the US. And there have been a lot of questions about his case ever since he was arrested. He's still imprisoned in poor health. In some respects, I'm surprised that the guy's still alive. The fact that there were federal officers killed might put doubt on the fact that he would ever be released, but I would ask that you send letters of asking for Biden to issue a clemency appeal based on his age. And at least I personally think the guy should be moved from Florida. He's in a US penitentiary in Florida. He should at least be allowed to be closer to his homeland in the Dakotas, closer to his family. I don't know how many more years, months, or weeks the guy has left. So that's my brief update. Kelly, I don't know much about the other cases that we dealt with last year. I thought you might have something
Oh,
to
no,
say.
that's okay. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mostly was turning it over to you for the Leonard Peltier update. I did stick a link in the chat. One of the issues that we focused on for Get on the Bus 2023 was a Tibetan monk who had been in prison, Rinchen Saltram. He was released from prison on February 1st. He had been in prison for 4.5 years for some WeChat posts and a website that he maintained. It's important to note, as we've heard from previous Get on the Bus speakers who were former political prisoners imprisoned by the Chinese government, that even after someone is released from prison, it isn't necessarily true freedom. They're often still monitored and harassed, as well as their family members. But when we were starting to plan for Get on the Bus 2024, this event, Rinchen Saltram was one of the people that we wanted to focus on, and we were pleased to see that before the event that he at least has been released. And so I encourage you to follow that link to learn more about his case. And I don't know if any of the other action coordinators or Group 133 members have any other additional updates from what has happened in the past year from 2023 Get on the Bus actions that you'd like to share. I think obviously there's overlap because we focused on Trinco 5 last year in other situations. Any other questions or comments for our speakers today? Okay. Well, so I know there was one question about, why we weren't in person. We had mentioned that we ran into some difficulties. A lot of logistics are involved in planning Get on the Bus. The last time we had an in-person Get on the Bus was in actually April 5th, 2019. And then we had to cancel our 2020 event as, everything shut down in April 2020. But we did have some difficulty securing insurance for the venue for the speakers panel. And it wasn't necessarily something that we wouldn't eventually be able to get through, but the timeline that was available, it would take, weeks to do that. And just given the logistics and the thousands of dollars it takes to put together an in-person event, if we may not have had a decision on the insurance until perhaps yesterday or this morning. And so we couldn't, we didn't think that it was a good use of resources and to bring people to New York if we wouldn't necessarily be able to access the venue. We continue to stay in touch with Cooper Union, which was our host. And so we're hoping to plan a future event. When we do have the rallies, we are escorted by the New York City Police Department, and they had, granted us our permits for the rallies, and they're, eager to work with us again in the future. So whether it's as Get on the Bus or some other Amnesty International event, we hope to see everyone in person in New York or closer to Boston where our group is based. But we're also grateful to be able to join with activists around the world in this Zoom format. So we are going to keep on getting on the virtual bus and working together as activists. And as a follow-up from today's event, we will be sending out an email. So if you registered for the event, we'll send links to the online petitions and actions, as well as additional information around the human rights situations in Egypt, in Iran, in Sri Lanka, in China, in Tibet, and around the world related to UN and climate issues. And so we encourage you to share those links and resources with your colleagues, your fellow Amnesty activists, and others in your community. We'll also make a copy of this recording available. So if you have friends and colleagues who weren't able to join us for this live stream, to be able to share that video. And we look forward to staying in touch over the weeks and months ahead. We are really grateful to everyone who makes Get on the Bus possible, including Amnesty staff, Group 133 members, and our amazing speakers today. We are grateful. Paul, I know, already had to leave, but Yusuf and Jim and Lakshmi and Tissa and Elise and Shaheen and Tenzin and Dr. Sarah Sek and Kip and others. And we hope that you will join us, whether it's in person or online, for Get on the Bus 2025. And I'm going to turn it over to Anna and Rick to see if you have any closing remarks.
No, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Kelly. You did a great job moderating. Next year in person.
Cheers to that.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. But in the meantime, we're grateful for your solidarity and cooperation and collaboration on human rights and social justice issues. Thanks so much.